Peak oil demand postponed. This is Cleveland Jones, Professor Cleveland Jones, and this is me, Armando Cavain. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Nice to be with you again, Kavanya. Good day.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Before we start with your presentation, let me bring some provocative questions, thoughts to give you some more, let's see, spicy comments on this thing. So the first one is the president of Transversal Consulting said hydrocarbon use will continue to grow. Okay, it's a great statement. The manager of a communication institute of energy research, it's extremely unlikely that we are anywhere close to peak oil demand. Strong statement again. Again, the same guy from the energy research said the net zero policies that have been pursued in some countries have been a complete disaster. Another person saying that hundreds of millions of people, it's important, in the developing world still lack access to affordable and reliable energy. As those countries develop, they will contribute to the growing demand for oil and gas, natural gas. So it's very important, Stevens saying a very good point. Salazar. From intelligence research. Peak demand feels farther away than what we had originally anticipated.
Yeah.
OPEC anticipates global oil demand to 112 million barrels a day, and International Energy Agency estimates 105. Today we have almost 100 million barrels per day, so it's important that's growing for both. Stephen saying that it's very important for my understanding, substitute for oil for planes, ships seem very challenging, and petrochemicals, plastics demand, and others should be stronger than expected for longer. That's my provocative questions for you, of course, and please see if you could start your presentation, Professor Cleveland.
Yes, you see, some of what we've just been shown there really alludes to a lot of different opinions. But again, a lot of people that have different opinions can be right. It just depends on when they may be right. But I agree, it's a very difficult topic. But in any case, I want to start just by talking about primary energy, not just oil and gas, because I think almost universally we have no real disagreement. Primary energy demand will grow a lot. And we discussed this in other programs, more numerical information. Primary energy has to grow a lot. It will grow a lot, and it will grow a lot in most regions of the world outside of the very developed world. So with that backdrop, we know that the actual energy that people will use and demand will go up. That energy, of course, is composed not just of oil and gas, it's composed of coal and of course, hydroelectric dams producing electricity, that kind of thing. But the bottom line that we have to start with is that general energy demand will grow very much. The next thing you alluded to, this energy poverty is a very real phenomenon, and it's not something that we can just matter-of-factly dismiss. Yes, it's prevalent in Africa, less developed countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, even Central Asia, and so on. But it is very real, and it's very significant because we see the kind of scale, the orders of magnitude of difference in energy use among different populations around the world. This inequality eventually has to be narrowed. It will not turn into an equality. The world is not destined for an equitative world, but it will significantly be reduced. How? By these countries and many others who are less developed countries with much lower energy per capita consumption increasing their energy demand. So this again strengthens the argument that overall energy demand is set to go up very much. Um, and of course, there is the backdrop of UN population projections. Many other entities have projections. I just picked the UN because they provide a good uh, confidence interval there, which very reasonably is very wide because there's a great deal of uncertainty as to where we're going. Just today, I was researching a very thoughtful article that is suggesting that most analysts are very wrong, and that the world population is destined to decrease dramatically, even by 2050, and certainly significantly by 2030. We don't see that in most projections because most people assume, yeah, we'll continue growing. Africa and many other places are growing very fast. India is still growing a little bit. So these predictions are prone to a lot of uncertainty. But the bottom line is, if you have a population that is growing, or at least growing for some time out into 2030 or 2040 or 2050, then overall demand will accompany that as well. If, on the other hand, population decreases, as some, not a majority, this is a small minority that are proposing that based on uh, birth rates and so on, then the whole thing can change a lot. And this is an example of a very small difference in the basic assumptions that you make for those projections, resulting in very large changes out into the future. So this is something we have to watch. And the other thing, as you pointed out, and many people are basing their continuing oil demand projections on the petrochemical market, because this is an area that is overwhelmingly not changed very much in its feedstocks. It is, 99.9% oil based, and it has been for a long time. And it doesn't, at least from extrapolations of recent history, it doesn't show any sign of changing. This, I think I discussed with you a while back when I said that if all we have to do to make forecasts is to look back 10 or 20 years and get a ruler or put it in Excel and extrapolate, then you don't need an analyst. You don't need someone to think. You just extrapolate. I think the key here is to understand when basic assumptions change, and then the recent history might be very different in the future. You cannot extrapolate. And I think this is an area where we have to be very careful because, demand out to 2030 could be close to 1 billion metric tons. If this trend is correct, as most people are very close to this. But again, as I said, if some things in the next few years change significantly, it could have a big change. So it's very important to watch this also. So, yeah.
Professor Cleveland, please. And we know that petrochemical feedstock, there are no replacement for those yet. So there is no, let's say, science and technology to replace fossil fuels as derivatives, as feedstock and raw materials for petrochemical.
Well, I think that is the reasoning behind this extrapolation, this forecast, because people look and say, what technology is out there that we can expect to make 5, 10, 20% inroads into feedstocks? And right now, I think the safe bet, the general view is that there are no alternatives. Well, in fact, there are alternatives. They may not be economically feasible, which means that they're not alternatives at the moment. There are many technically viable alternatives, but until they become economically viable, that's meaningless.
Yeah.
Many things are technically possible, but they're just not practical. I think that we're not that far from changes. The question is, how much of a change do we need for this to actually change out to 2030 or 2050. Because if you change a little bit back here, maybe the changes could be significant. And I think that in all of these views, we have to keep uh, the drivers of increasing demand on one side and the drivers of maybe decreasing demand on the other side, because there are things going on as well. But I think this is, so far we've seen a lot of things that are arguing for a strengthening or a continuing strong demand for oil, and certainly for oil and gas. This is a reality, but we have to be careful, and this is what we have to discuss and think about a little ahead. Um, there is the other side of the coin, that at least in some developed countries, and we went through this in a program of ours where we discussed, the world is in a dichotomy. You have the developed world going one direction and pushing hard for an energy transition, and maybe a bigger part of the world isn't. But in this developed world, for example, you see a very remarkable renewable energy additions. This is by itself is not significant enough to make predictions change, but there are trends there. And these additions to renewable energies, which eventually will, of course, compete or displace some oil and gas, may just be additive or they may be substitutive. And this is the key question. And we have to see at what level will they grow to the point that they will not only add to the energy base, but they will actually displace. And then we have to discuss what energies will they displace? Will they displace coal because it's the dirtiest? Or will they displace oil because in the developed world, that is the trend that they're aiming for, and coal use is already slightly less. So this is important to keep in mind. Again, prognosis is not just drawing a curve from past data. You have to think about it, and you have to take into consideration what is going on. And especially, as you know, I'm a big pundit of technology is what can drive the major changes in the world, not just preferences and so on. But there are other things too, which I will approach. And then in terms of one of the realities that might argue against some of the very fast growth in oil demand, or a very sustained growth in oil demand, is a reality of where oil and gas reserves are located in the world. And, scratch off Venezuela, because you and I have discussed this many times. Venezuela is an imaginary, illusory resource base, 1/10 or less. But you see, of course, the Middle East, everybody knows, Russia, Central Asia, the United States and Canada, of course. You know that I am a proponent of Brazil's place in the oil world with multi-hundred billion barrel producible, recoverable resources. So Brazil is there. But as the world goes on, and we're talking not just 10 or 20 or 30 years, some of these resources, or at least the resources that are more easily recoverable, closer to the main consuming regions, or in safer regions, will eventually be drawn down. And if you look at this list on the right side, of the 20 countries with the listed largest oil reserves in the world, only 4 or 5 are countries that are considered safe or reasonable countries to depend on their oil production. Russia, you can scratch from this. It has tremendous resources. But nowadays, people realize how safe is Russia to rely on for future oil and gas supplies. So this it comes into a realm of economics, which is very new. It provided for a Nobel Prize in economics. Demand also depends a little bit on supply, because if people perceive that the major suppliers of oil in the world going forward will be countries that you cannot rely on. Some Middle East countries that are in the middle of strife zones, or Russia, which is, potentially an adversary, or things like that. Then policymakers in consuming countries might say, hey, we know the oil is there, but we have to move away because that's not safe. It can happen again, just like in Europe. The gas was cut off, or the oil might get cut off, or we have another 1970s, embargo, any of these things. So this is a very important thing to recognize because most people, and I have said so many times, we are nowhere close to running out of oil. Peak oil, forget it. That's not even in discussion. What we're concerned about is how will the remaining resources drive the policies of the countries that are major consumers, mostly the developed world and so on. What will they do? Right now, we know China is very actively working to diversify their supply so that they will have a safe, more secure energy basis to grow on. They don't want to be reliant on Russia. Of course, they'll import cheap oil as much as they can now that it's a bargain in relation to other oil. But looking out in the future, they don't want Russia providing 80 or 90% of their oil. They don't want one country or a small region in the Middle East providing all their oil. That is not a situation that reasonable economies and countries want to be put in. So this is an important realization that long-term policy might actually be driven, not because they want to, but they might be driven out of necessity or fear of the consequences to move away from some of their oil base just because they cannot afford to rely on the supply of that oil. This is a very tricky question, but I put it out there so they can think about it.
Uh-huh.
And then again, we've seen, although this graph is just the top of the curve, but you see, of course, the seasonal variations in the oil demand, summer and winter in the northern hemisphere, mainly driving the squiggles in oil demand. And then, bam, you have the COVID pandemic. And what happens? A tremendous destruction of demand from a crisis. And I know I don't mean to be insensitive, and I don't mean to be a denier, but the COVID pandemic resulted in much less than 10 million deaths. Arguably it can be 5 or whatever, but it's a pandemic, yes. But overall deaths were 10 million, and in relation to many other diseases and famine and dysentery and so on in Africa, that's not a lot. And it provided, a 15% drop momentarily in oil demand. And so this proves that a crisis of whatever type can be very strong influence on oil demand. And generally, of course, we think of crisis just like that, a blip. It happens in 1-2 years, you overcome it, and of course, we're past the crisis and we're back to pre-COVID demand levels and so on. But who says that a crisis will only last 1 or 2 years? We actually were lucky.
Yeah, but Cleveland, this picture, this chart shows that the peak oil should occur in before 2030. It's totally different from OPEC and including International Energy Agency.
Yeah, I want you
predictions.
only to look at the green part. Forget that, because this is looking back. I'm just using this as an example of what a crisis can do to the demand. And certainly the demand, everything was going dandy, the demand was going up, just a squiggle from seasonal, and then bam. Going forward, we've already seen, we recovered from the crisis, and from here on out, we can discuss what's going to happen. But the point is that a crisis, even a very short duration crisis, of course, it was short, can have a very devastating effect on oil demand. And what we discussed a while back in one of our programs, things that can go awfully wrong in the world and destroy demand, and certainly the various types of crisis from geophysical major earthquakes here and there,
But
volcanoes, everything can affect
but
that.
but Cleveland is a temporary destruction of demand. It's not a, let's say, a
Well,
constant
that's
one.
that's my point. This was, say, 2 years COVID, but we're talking about pandemics going forward, and it's no reason to be alarmist. But all major analysts of the term consider that we have been very lucky with COVID because it could be a 10-year crisis with 10 times more deaths. And there's no reason why this, or even a major geological accident, or
Yeah.
geopolitical catastrophes, wars, especially a major war in the Middle East or something like that, would destroy not just production and logistics, but also demand from crisis situations. Uh,
Mhm.
we have another economic crisis like 2008. There, we had a smaller blip, but who says that the crisis will only be 2 or 3% drop? Maybe it's a 10% drop. We can have a major recession for whatever reason. And these things cannot be discounted. They're less likely, of course, but if they do happen, the effects can be devastating. And
And
the
it's important that you are bringing to us. So in the demand side, but in the supply side, you can have some disruption.
Exactly. So this is the concern. Some things that affect supply will obviously affect demand because you just won't have the supply to have that demand. But going forward, you also plan for that. And in terms of crisis, we at that time we also spoke about environmental crisis, social crisis. If we have major migrations, and that leads to conflicts, even if it's not an outright war, conflicts can be a simmering thing that expands over a wide crescent in Northeast Africa, for example. These things can happen. They have been pointed out, they have been studied, they have been discussed. And if that happens, we can see demand destruction that can be last for longer, and it can be as significant or more than it was during the COVID.
Yeah, it's
Sepal.
interesting. Seppo Corpella.
Yeah. Yes, people will not admit, oh no, this is impossible. Our supply is guaranteed. It's difficult to see outside of the Gulf of Mexico or some safe areas like that. How can Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, certainly Iran, Iraq, how can they guarantee that their oil supply is safe? Saudi Arabia has spare supply, which is wonderful for stabilizing oil prices when everything is smooth and we don't have major wars and we don't have major logistical bottlenecks in the Middle East. But if you have a major crisis, it doesn't matter if you have, spare capacity. The thing
Yeah,
will just unravel.
yeah, doesn't
And I
matter.
don't want to bring such negative things out so much because I'm not saying that these are very likely. I'm just saying that these can happen and the chances are cumulative. If you have 30 years from now, the chances that something will happen during that
You,
time are
you,
certainly greater.
what you mean that the risk is low, but the impact is very strong.
Is very strong, and the risk is proportional to how long you incur it. So that it will happen in the next 5 years, yeah, very small chance. That it will happen in 10, well, maybe some chance. That it will happen in 20 or 30 years, now
Yeah,
it's not a negligible risk anymore because many things can happen in 20 or 30 years, and
perfect.
several of them can happen. Maybe not just one giant pandemic. Maybe you can have a pandemic. You can have geological occurrence. You can have social unrest. You can have an economic downturn. All of these things can act together. They can grow in each other. That is a reality that it makes very complex science of putting these things together. One of the ways that I have thought about this is to actually do a Monte Carlo simulation of how bad can each individual thing be, and you combine those, and it's not an additive; it's a probabilistic analysis. It's very powerful, but of course, you still have to have some idea of what the probabilities are, and who has a good idea of how likely a new pandemic is. but this is
Yeah,
another thinking point.
good, very good.
Um, and then in terms of petrochemicals, which you mentioned, and rightly so, I think most analysts will say petrochemicals will be one of the last major demand sources for oil that will be affected. And that is probably true. But eventually things will change. And the key here is how fast they will change. And I think that we are, again, because of technology, and you know how I think that technology can bring about, uh, uh, changes, vast changes, paradigm changes in how things work. And so it's not just looking at the past and extrapolating into the future, because now, for example, many universities are actively studying uh, feedstocks for petrochemical industry. And sure, if we look at corn or sugarcane or even wood, we're not going to destroy the forests of the world, or we're not going to stop feeding pigs with corn in order to supply petrochemicals. But there are great possibilities of increasing those sources in general to the point where they can make a significant impact in overall petrochemical feedstock supply. Say, might reach 5 or 10%. That is a significant amount. Or it might reach 20 if things get to the point where, especially with algae and residues from agricultural base that are mostly now just wasted, if they can be directed with enzymatic processes, mostly microbiological processes, into alternative feedstocks to complement oil feedstocks, then you might actually have, certainly not in 5 or 10 years, maybe, but in 10 years or 20 years. And we're looking out to 2050, not just, in the next few years. That can have an effect. So it is important not to say that something is written in stone, petrochemicals can't change.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
it's
That's
very
right.
difficult to change,
They
but
are
there is a process.
replaceable, but takes
Yeah,
time.
and these technologies, which are all pretty well understood, even the microbiological processes are understood. Of course, the individual complex combinations of microbes and microorganisms still have to be developed and understood and so on. But the process is under study. And of course, if we have an accelerating development with artificial intelligence, which is already providing very fast development of new drugs, it will also provide development of what the changes have to be in how you provide these inputs in order for them to become usable. On the other side here, this factory thing, yes, there are also metal formulations that can provide not only combinations but separations and many other processes that can harness CO2, that can provide separation of compounds and so on, that can be very effective in providing some alternatives for particular feedstock inputs. Maybe not all of them, because some of these pathways are more economical for certain feedstocks. But if you can provide, 40% of a particular feedstock, you already have a very big impact on the overall. And these things, I'm just saying, they're in their infancy. Right now, as you know, petrochemicals are still, exceedingly reliant on oil feedstocks. But we're working on that. And if
Yeah,
in the next 5 years, for example, we have major inroads, another 10 years may be enough to make that really change. And that is, very significant.
perfect.
Um, well, before I want to stop here and see if maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the way that we think about these changes, because um, I've discussed that we have to think about time frames, whether 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years or more. That makes a difference with what will happen when. And we also have to think in terms of geographical or regional or worldwide implications. because some of these things are actually very likely to have an impact, but maybe their impact will even be localized. For example, in Western Europe, because that is a fast developed world, developing things towards an energy transition. So their impact can be significant locally, but and maybe even regionally, but not overall in the world. On the other hand, there are some other changes going on that could have very worldwide implications. And so, even if they're not very strong, the impact can be all over the world. And in some cases, some changes that we have seen, and I want to talk about this a little bit, is greater natural gas use, greater LNG use, despite the United States backtracking a little bit on new LNG development. This is a trend that will grow tremendously. Not just the US and Qatar and Australia and other countries developing natural gas resources for export as LNG. And ultimately, that can also impact, to some extent, oil demand, because in many cases, energetic oil can be substituted with LNG.
And there is a point to ask to you. So it's not necessary to have all products, all derivatives replacing
Right.
current oil. You can have one
Sure.
viable one that can replace and each other, and we can have a series of them.
This is one of the things we've seen, and we've also discussed this in terms of renewable and alternative energies. Solar has had a very sharp and fast growth. Wind has had that. Yet, that I believe that wind is not ultimately the big winner. But right now, because of cost considerations, it has been a big winner. But if you look,
Yeah,
20,
but not for
50 years,
petrochemicals.
no,
Not
no.
for
I'm just saying, as an
okay,
example of,
energy,
yeah,
electricity.
as an example of things that grow, but we've only seen a very small time slice.
Yeah,
If we look at 100 years, 50 years back and 50 years forward, wind is barely a needle in that time frame, you know, and who knows that it's going to remain high. I think it will actually be the slice. So many of these things are like that. If you look back a long time, yes, they've been there. And if you look forward 50 years, maybe in 50 years' time, a lot of this will change and these will be blips.
no doubt.
They grew and then, but it is important to look at at least, in three ways: the short term, the medium term, and the long term. That's why I have this table here that we can discuss a little.
Perfect, perfect.
If I can talk about it.
You have the table.
Yeah. Yeah, first I want to, we discussed this, the drivers of continuing oil demand. And we mentioned the developing countries are focused on affordability. Oil and even coal, of course, are affordable, more so than renewable energies and so on for the moment. Even when we talk about affordability, remember, we have to talk about capital costs. Because even if you say, oh, but solar energy is very cheap, yes, long term and so on, if you amortize the upfront costs, many countries don't have the capital resources to invest in these things.
Yeah,
so oil is, in a sense, is very inexpensive. You pay it right now, you use it, that's it. And so this demand is a very strong and likely to continue. And of course, we just touched on reduction of energy poverty, where energy has to be available. People have to stop using cow dung and sticks and have gas stoves and oil heaters and so on. Not just medieval energy sources.
Yeah.
And certainly, I didn't speak about this, but longer life expectancy has an impact on demand because older people in general have higher per capita energy demand because they're not only doing productive work age, but also in retirement. So as populations age in many regions, this also drives energy demand.
Interesting.
Certainly population increase, higher overall population, greater demand. And then, of course, we mentioned non-substitutable energy uses, not just petrochemical, as we discussed, many industries have a very difficult time in converting their energy inputs from their current inputs, which include steel and cement and others.
Yeah.
Again, this is an area that can change, but right now and for the foreseeable short term, this is very difficult to change. Besides the transportation means that were mentioned there, airplanes and heavy duty transport and so on, even trains and so on, you're not going to see electrification in those sectors reach significant levels for a very long time.
Yeah.
Anything can happen in 100 years. I'm talking 20, 30. And then, of course, there's an interesting thing here, which we didn't discuss, is this net zero backtracking, which we saw in Europe. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe was all gung-ho about being green and all of this. And all of a sudden, gas is gone. People don't want to freeze, and they extend the lifetime of their coal plants, and they start thinking about these other things. They begin importing a lot of LNG, drawing in oil for many things. So this is a realization of the market realities, because availability, affordability, and security have to be considered. And people just forgot about that for a while, when everything was more or less peaceful. And of course, we discussed petrochemicals. So this is a good way to think about all of the, or most, maybe others that I haven't put down, ways that we can justify the continuing extrapolation of the current trends that we have, certainly near the 100 million barrels.
Let me make a comment. And for petrochemicals, that's growing too much in terms of oil demand from 30 to 40% of the total oil demand. So petrochemicals is being stronger every day.
And this is because, in part, higher levels of well-being as China moves into higher development levels, petrochemical products, the plastics and all of those products are much more in demand. And right now, China has 40% of the plastics demand of civilized West. So as it continues to develop, its demand for plastics and thus demands for petrochemicals will increase exponentially, more than just from current levels. And this is even more so the case of India, which we again discuss in other programs. India is some years behind China, but it will follow some of those trends, maybe in an accelerated way, because now the path has been set. India can maybe make that transition even faster, and it can grow its demand for petrochemicals maybe even faster than China, and its demand for overall energy, and its demand of its energy poor, which India is, of course, much poorer country than China. It has a greater percentage of energy poverty, many people still living at the very bottom of the pyramid. So the conversion of those people into higher strata of energy consumption and demand for higher value products, including petrochemicals, that can have an explosive demand. And it's not just China and then India. We're talking about some Southeast Asia and maybe even further back, a lot of Africa. Africa has 10 countries that are over 100 million population or so. As they develop, and they're way back even from India, as they develop, we're looking at trends that can accelerate this demand. So, but now, okay, all that said, I wanted to go on and also bring out the drivers of reduced demand, because they exist. We can't ignore them, And developed countries,
both sides, we need to see both sides.
In developed countries, that certainly is the case. I would say more so in Western Europe than even the United States, but there's a faster energy transition. There's more emphasis on looking for alternatives. As difficult as that may be, and as problem fraught as that is.
But but not for petrochemicals, for instance, more than
No,
for electricity from wind and solar. So,
yeah, even for oil demand that comes from refining for gasoline production, if car demand actually gets electrified, it may not make sense for the rest of the world. But if they electrify, of course, they will reduce demand somewhat.
yeah,
Uh, and of course, I mentioned geopolitical concerns. This is a forward looking uh, policy change where if the policy makers are wise and take astute decisions going forward, they can say, we have to reduce some of our dependency on oil because in 20 years, much of it will come from very unstable countries. And we cannot only rely on the Gulf of Mexico,
and
Guyana,
they
Brazil.
call and they call near shoring, friend shoring, so moving supply source
Yeah,
from outside
yeah,
to more near
yeah.
process.
And the United States has been the great beneficiary of this nearshoring because of all the oil and gas in the Gulf Coast. But you
Yeah,
know, of course, we are seeing still very fast growth in oil supply from Guyana, and we will continue to see that. You know, we're talking about another million and another million forecasted. Brazil has great potential, as we've discussed many times. Maybe even in the time frame that we're discussing, we could see Brazil at 10 million barrels a day, which is another 5 or 6 million, and that can lighten up the concern that some of the problem supplies from the Middle East or from Iran or other
yeah.
sources can be a reason to try to move away from oil dependency. Maybe safer supplies can help that, but still the forward-looking
Yeah.
view of policymakers can take that into consideration. We discussed this gas and LNG eventually being able to displace some oil. I think it will probably just be a complement to the energy supply, and if anything, it will probably displace coal more than anything else. So it's maybe won't affect oil in per se as much. Um, and then new sources of energy as substitutes for oil. We discussed this in other programs, you know, alternative energies, renewable energies. Very difficult to forecast a significant change in the short or medium term. This is not going to happen, you know, in the next 5 or 10 years. Maybe 15, maybe 20 years, some of these changes might come about. And you know, as crazy as it might seem, I believe, for example, hydrogen 20 years from now might make some inroads. Maybe 30 years from now, we will be able to bring up, you know, nuclear in a larger way if we achieve that. This is 30 years. This is 2050. You know, it's not close, but we have to think that far. And certainly, even near, maybe not near, but medium term outlook, hydrogen for steel, cement, and refineries can be an important change if we can provide that hydrogen in quantity, and that depends on technology, which I mentioned, you know, white and
Yeah.
other types of hydrogen that
And,
are not
and,
green
and
hydrogen. I don't
next,
believe in green
we are planning to have you in the next week meeting with Paul Taylor to discuss specifically hydrogen. So
Exactly.
that'll be
We
tricky.
will touch on this because I think this is where we can disagree a lot, but you know, it's
I do
possible.
not agree with you. Okay, I see
I
that
know.
hydrogen needs more energy than the energy that
Well,
they deliver
green
back. But
hydrogen for sure. That's why I think that
yeah,
this hydrogen for the industry cannot come from green hydrogen. And all of
yeah,
these plans that people are making are you know, dead in the water. But eventually that
okay,
can be significant because these industries by themselves are
yeah,
20 or more percent of the energy demand. And then of
okay.
course petrochemicals, where it's going to be very, very difficult to change. So that is the two sides. I think the exercise here is which side
Uh,
is stronger and when.
yeah, this chart's important because Mr. Fatid Biro will love your drivers for this reduction of demand.
That I will show him the other one also, because he can't just look at one. And anybody that discusses these concerns, they can't just look at one side. Now, obviously, I have some ideas, But that doesn't mean that one slide is stronger than the other. It just means that there are competing forces, and maybe some will gain in one area, others will lose in other areas, and ultimately, like I said, you have to balance this with a probabilistic analysis of which ones are more likely to have successes and which ones are more likely not to go ahead, and then say what the net effect is. But I think it's pretty clear that the net effect is that you cannot expect in the near term, which is maybe up to 10 years from now, you cannot expect that to lead to an inflection point. So oil demand is not very likely to peak before 10 years. That's after 10 years, I think there is a good chance that it will, because I personally, again, is arguable, I have great faith in technology that can make some very fundamental changes in
Okay,
technology in the world.
perfect. Uh-huh.
Very good.
Do you have any other slide here?
Well, I um,
Oh, great.
you
The
had
different
this,
visions. It's
yeah.
important. Very, very
But
important.
you see, this is now a couple of years old when it was made, but I think it's very important to see how many people are out there, serious people, not loonies alone, you know, forecasting oil production. And these are people who are earnestly trying to do their best to come up with a forecast. And it's more or less all over the place. I think it's even more all over the place if you consider other research centers other than just these main ones, because then the dispersion is even greater. So we see that this is not for amateurs. The forecast going out to 2040, and if
But,
you extend this to
but
2050, it's even spread
yeah, but
out.
it's very interesting because more than 50% of the entities do not see peak oil demand for 2040.
But that
They
is because most of these entities that are serious forecasters are somehow not related to the oil industry, but they understand the importance of the oil industry. And
Mhm.
many of the pundits that forecast a lower uh, uh, peak oil demand and lower demand are not related to the oil companies,
That's
obviously,
right. That's
and
right.
they're more related to just research. More, I wouldn't say in a vacuum, but they're very focused on technologies and not on market realities.
Mhm.
So I think the combination is that you have some people being very realistic and seeing that no, demand is going to go and grow for at least 10, 15 years.
Oh, okay. But going to the point, and in your opinion, the peak oil demand will be in which year?
Well,
Ah,
obviously there will be a peak demand. Whether that's in 1,000 years, I guarantee it. But I think it will not be in the next 10 years. The
uh,
peak demand will not be. So we will be probably uh, steadying, getting to a plateau, and certainly out to 10 years, maybe 120 or whatever, a million barrels a day. It will not peak until then, at least.
uh,
Then there is a great chance, just because of time, if you give it 10, 15, 20 years, technology will catch up. And then all bets are off, because
uh,
technology, once it gets going, can make great changes. So, for 10 or 15 years, we're 100% within this band. After that, yes, we're almost certainly going to see some big changes in oil demand. And then again, it's a question of how fast it will drop.
yeah,
But that's another discussion.
yeah, that's right. Very good, very good. Your conclusion was fantastic. There is a comment here from Seppo. Let's see, Seppo is a fantastic professor. They are
Yeah.
forecasting demand, not supply. Uh, uh,
Yeah, again, supply is a whole nother ballpark, and we discussed this in some other programs when we discussed, what can happen and so on. Yes, supply is another thing, but we're assuming that it's in the interest of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, even the U.S. to continue providing the supply. Yeah.
Yeah, but supply is a result of demand. There is no supply itself.
Exactly, but I'm saying they are going to be willing to supply that demand. If there is a demand, they will be willing to supply it. The only time we've seen that break down is, for example, in the oil embargo, when there was a very concerted effort to really slash oil production. I don't think we will ever see that again. I mean, not even Russia and Saudi Arabia together or for any other reason are very likely to come together and say, we will cut production by 10, 20 million barrels a day. No, that is, the supply might come down for other reasons, but not voluntarily.
Yeah, I'm confused with the question from Professor Copello because who are they in this case for him? For
I,
him?
those lines, yeah, those lines
Oh,
are basically demand forecasts.
yeah, they will supply, of course, until they
Yeah,
can't.
yeah.
That's clear.
But the
Okay.
entity, it's important to recognize a lot of these entities are very reliable and so on. But there are many others that are research institutions that have very different prognosis. Yet, as I'm saying, after 20 years, maybe they will be right. But that's way far ahead, not right now.
Let me invite Professor Seppo Corpella to be with Cleveland Jones and have a discussion about this issue again, because it's a
Yeah,
very important point in the
yeah.
discussion of energy for the near future. No doubts. You are invited, Seppo.
Policymakers have to go into this. They can't dismiss these points matter of factly. Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you so much. Was a
very good,
long
Cabaya.
but very welcome discussion today with Professor Cleveland Jones.
Okay, thank you a lot. Bye bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.